My parents turned their backs on me when they found out I couldn't have children. My husband sided with them and left too. But when I finally managed to get pregnant, they all suddenly decided to come back. And then my ex showed up at my house. I'm 30. Recently, I ran into my parents and my ex-husband Scott, who's 33, and I still don't know how to process it. For context, I haven't spoken to my parents in almost 3 years. The same goes for my ex. We divorced 3 years ago and cut off all contact. More than that, I made sure I'd never have to see them again. They nearly destroyed my life, wrecked my mental health to the point where I felt like I didn't even deserve to exist. After the divorce, I moved to the suburbs, trying to start over, away from everything that reminded me of my past. That's why running into them now hit me like a truck. I said something to them that I'm not sure was the right thing. My parents always wanted a son. They didn't mistreat me outright as a child, but it was painfully obvious that if I had been born a boy, they would have treated me differently. My mother even said it a few times. I did everything I could to be the son they never had, but it was never enough. After college, when I started living on my own, I tried to maintain a relationship with them. Like it or not, they were my only family. I wasn't close to my grandparents, had no uncles or aunts to rely on, so no matter how much they pushed me away, I still held on to the idea that they were my family. Even if they didn't seem to care much about me, I kept reaching out. At 23, I met Scott at a concert. Sparks flew immediately, and after 6 months of dating, I introduced him to my parents. That's when things changed. Suddenly, they made an effort. They called more often, asked about my life. My relationship showed interest in me for the first time. I noticed it, but since it felt good, I didn't question it. The longer I was with Scott, the more my parents inserted themselves into my life. At some point, it felt like we were one big happy family, and I didn't question it. I should have. After 2 years together, we got engaged. 3 years later, we were married. Everything was great at first, and I loved being married. But 6 months in, my parents started hinting hard that they wanted grandkids. I was only 26. I wasn't ready. I wanted to wait a few years, but with their constant pressure, I brought it up to Scott, and he was thrilled by the idea. His enthusiasm won me over, and we decided to try for a baby right away. Months passed, but nothing happened. We started to suspect something was wrong, so we got tested. The results? I was infertile. It hit us both hard, but I think my parents took it the worst. They didn't even try to hide their disappointment. The day we broke the news to both families, my father literally walked out of the room instead of comforting me. Scott and I decided to take a break from trying. We discussed alternatives like IVF, but it was expensive, and success wasn't guaranteed. We agreed to put it off until we could afford multiple rounds. It was disappointing, sure, but we were willing to wait. My parents? They were furious. They stopped visiting, stopped calling. No matter how much I tried to explain that it wasn't my fault, they didn't want to hear it. Weeks later, their behavior had me so depressed that I finally snapped. I called them and told them everything I'd bottled up for years, that they were cruel to me just because I couldn't give them a grandchild, that it made me doubt if they would even be good grandparents if I ever did manage to have a baby, that they had treated me coldly my whole life just because I wasn't born a boy, and yet they adored my husband. I told them I'd spent years ignoring it, trying to keep things together, but I was done. I didn't want to hear from them ever again. Saying it hurt more than I expected. For years, all I had wanted was their approval. But that day I realized I was never going to get it, was because I was finally pregnant, something they had written me off for years ago. Instead of apologizing or showing any kind of remorse, they just doubled down on their behavior. They agreed that it was best for us to never talk again because in their eyes, I was a useless woman since I couldn't have children. They didn't want anything to do with me. It hurt like hell to hear that, but at least I finally knew exactly where I stood with them. That was the last time I spoke to my parents. Our relationship was over. When I told Scott about that phone call, at first, he was sympathetic. But after a few days, I started to notice a shift in his behavior. Something was off. I tried to ignore it. I was already in a fragile emotional state and didn't want to admit to myself that maybe, just maybe, my husband was also going to leave me. I convinced myself everything was fine, but over the next few months, he became distant, cold like a completely different person. I did everything I could to save our marriage. I fought for it, gave it my all. But it didn't matter. One day, he came home with divorce papers in hand and told me he was done. I can't say I was shocked, but I still tried to reason with him. I told him we could try again for a child later, that we had options. But he just shook his head and said he had many reasons for leaving, and he didn't feel like getting into them. He wanted it over with quickly because, in his words, it was hard on both of us. The divorce dragged on for nearly 7 months. It was the hardest time of my life. I was completely alone, utterly broken. And then, just a few weeks after Scott left, I found out from some relatives that he had moved in with my parents. I knew asking them for an explanation was pointless, so I reached out to Scott's parents instead. That conversation was awful, but they at least gave me some answers. Turns out, my parents had been talking to Scott behind my back for months, possibly even manipulating him against me. That's why he left. His own parents disagreed with his decision and tried to talk him out of it, but he fought with them and cut them off too. I don't know exactly what my parents told him, but from what his parents said, Scott hinted that my own family told him he deserved better. I don't have the full story, but it seems my parents were so desperate to have a son that they decided to claim him as their own and convinced him to leave me in the process. After the divorce, I was shattered. It took me months just to find the strength to get out of bed, but eventually, I did. I made sure to erase every trace of my past. I moved to a new town, got a new job, changed my appearance, cut off all contact with my parents and Scott, blocked them on every platform. I even told old friends and extended family that I never wanted to hear anything about them again. Everyone respected that. For the past 3 years, I've been in therapy, rebuilding my life, and for the most part, I've been happy. The only thing that still lingered was my desire to have a child. Despite everything, I still wanted to be a mother. I knew I was ready. Last year, I went through IVF, and I got pregnant. Then, just a few days ago, I ran into them. Scott, my parents, on my own damn street. At first, I thought they were coming to see me, but then I realized they were actually leaving a house a few blocks down. When they saw me, I froze. I should have turned and walked away, but I was in complete shock. They came right up to me, greeted me as if nothing had ever happened, and immediately asked about the baby because, in their minds, I was supposed to be infertile. I told them the truth, and as it sank in, I started coming to my senses and turned to leave. But Scott stopped me. He said he was so happy to see me, that he'd been thinking about me a lot lately, that this had to be fate, some cosmic sign that we were meant to fix things and give our relationship another chance. Apparently, they had been visiting Scott's aunt, who had just moved into the neighborhood, and somehow he took running into me as some kind of message from the universe. My parents stood by his side, nodding along, pressuring me to invite them into my home. They wanted to catch up, to talk about everything, because they had missed so much of my life. I felt sick, the audacity they had to act like any of this was okay. Like they had any right to step back into my life after everything they'd done. It took me 3 years to put myself back together. And I'm still in therapy, still working through everything they did to me. I snapped. I told them I would rather let a pack of wild, bloodthirsty animals into my home than let them step foot inside. At least the animals would be better company. I told them to drop the act, to stop pretending they cared. Because the only reason they wanted to talk to me now was that I was finally pregnant. The only reason my parents suddenly wanted to talk to me again was because now they had a shot at getting a grandchild. And Scott, he wanted to reconnect because, clearly, he hadn't found anyone else. He figured that since I managed to get pregnant once, it wouldn't be a problem the next time. He thought he could just walk back into my life like nothing had ever happened. It made me sick. To them, I was never a person, just a womb, a tool for bringing children into the world. The moment I needed them the most, they abandoned me. I expected betrayal from my parents. They had spent my whole life making it clear that they had wanted a son instead. In their eyes, a woman's only worth was in her ability to be a mother. But the real shock, the real knife in my back, that came from Scott. Despite everything, he had agreed with my parents. He had sided with them, and for some twisted reason, he left me when I was at my lowest. I remembered every cruel word my parents had ever said to me. So, I threw their own words back at them. Since I was such a useless woman, and Scott deserved better, then maybe they should just leave me the hell alone. I'd always been a quiet, reserved person. But that day I lost it. 3 years of anger exploded out of me all at once. I screamed at them, right there in the middle of the street. It was messy, ugly, but I didn't care. When I was done, I ran home and slammed the door shut behind me. After that, I felt awful. I called out of work for a few days and stayed home with my daughter. But that encounter kept replaying in my head, over and over again. I had no idea how to process it. Then, last night, I got a call from an unknown number. Normally, I don't answer those, but for some reason, I did. It was Scott, and in the background, I could hear my parents whispering. They weren't even trying to be quiet. No, they wanted me to know they were there. I forced myself to stay calm and simply told him to never call me again. That if he or my parents tried to contact me, I would take action, and I really didn't want it to come to that. I made it clearer relationship ended 3 years ago. There was nothing left to say. But Scott begged me to listen, and for some reason, I did. He admitted that he had made a mistake, that my parents had too. But according to him, it was all because of their disappointment. He told me they had really wanted a child in the family, and when they found out I was infertile, they didn't handle it well. Apparently, that was his excuse for abandoning me. He said they all deserved a second chance to prove that they were worthy of being in my life. I sat there in silence for a few seconds before I responded. I told him I didn't believe a single damn word. If they actually cared about me, they wouldn't have needed to see me with a baby to come crawling back. That was the truth, and I was done pretending otherwise. I was about to hang up, but then my parents jumped in. They said this was exactly the kind of selfish behavior that had pushed them away in the first place. They actually believed that I had been the problem. According to them, when I found out I was infertile, I had made everything about myself. Instead of giving them space to process the news, I had forced my presence on them, had demanded their attention. They told me that they had distanced themselves because I had been inconsiderate, that I had pushed them away, and that was why I ended up alone. I didn't respond. I just hung up, because I knew exactly what they were trying to do. They were gaslighting me. But here's the thing, if they had really wanted a son so badly, why didn't they just have another child after me? I already knew the answer. My mother had complications during her pregnancy with me. Doctors told her she needed to wait a few years before trying again. But by then, she was already in her 30s. Waiting longer would have meant trying for a baby closer to 40, a much bigger risk. Just like I had struggled with infertility, she had too. The difference? When she went through it, her mother-in-law was cruel to her. When I went through it, my own mother was the one who tore me apart. That's why they never had another child. And as for Scott, I still don't fully understand his relationship with his parents. But from what I could tell, he had always gotten along with them just fine. At this point, I don't know if Scott ever made up with his parents after their last fight. I haven't spoken to them, and of course, I haven't spoken to Scott either. But I do know one thing: Scott was an only child. He never had to compete for his parents' attention. Every time I visited them, I could tell how much they adored him. They always treated him well, so I never understood why he latched onto my parents the way he did. With my parents, it made sense. They had always wanted a son, so of course, they welcomed Scott like the golden child they never had. But why did he go along with it? That, I never really questioned until now. For the last 3 years, I've done everything in my power to forget all of this. I never dwelled on it, never asked questions. But now that you've brought it up, I feel like I need to talk to his parents. Not because I expect closure, but just to understand. Maybe it'll give me some peace of mind. Or maybe I'm just curious. Either way, I decided to reach out. Update number 1. I spoke to my ex-in-laws today. I wanted to find out why Scott acted the way he did, why he practically became my parents' son. And honestly, I couldn't come up with a single good reason why he would be hanging out with my parents at his aunt's house. It made no sense. I already knew one thing: none of this was my fault. They all abandoned me when I needed them the most, simply because they were awful people. I had spent years trying to convince myself I was the problem, but I wasn't. Still, it felt strange reaching out to my former in-laws after 3 years of silence. The last time I had spoken to them was during the divorce. Thankfully, they were happy to hear from me. After some initial awkwardness, I got straight to the point. I asked them why Scott was so close to my parents and whether he was still in contact with them. They told me that after a few months of no contact, Scott eventually reconciled with his own parents, and they still kept in touch. But he also remained close with mine. That's when they revealed something I hadn't known before. My parents had been working on Scott from the very beginning. Even while we were dating, my parents would invite him over for dinner sometimes when I wasn't even home. They would spend time with him alone, making him feel special. Scott had told his parents about this back then, but he didn't see anything wrong with it. In fact, he thought it was a good thing. He assumed it meant he had impressed them, that he had won them over, and, in a way, he had, because all it really took to impress my parents was being a man. They had been forming a bond behind my back for years. Over time, Scott started seeing them as his second set of parents, even though he already had parents who loved him. It was complicated, messy, but that wasn't even the worst part. My parents bought his loyalty. They showered him with expensive gifts, regularly gave him money. And here's the kicker: those funds? That was the same money Scott had suggested we use for IVF when we were together. Back then, I had assumed he was bluffing, since neither of us had enough savings for the procedure. I had no idea he had secret funds coming in. But even then, I refused to rush into IVF. I had wanted to wait until we could afford it on our own, and I wasn't comfortable with the idea of him doing anything shady to get the money. What I didn't realize was that my own parents were the ones bankrolling him. They used that to manipulate him, to convince him that he deserved better than a wife who didn't believe in him. And after months of working on him, they finally got him to leave me. My former in-laws apologized. They told me they never approved of Scott's relationship with my parents, but he was their only son. They weren't going to cut him off over it, and I don't blame them. They didn't owe me anything. They didn't have to fix anything for me. But at least they told me the truth. And now that I know the truth, I have absolutely no reason to care if any of them ever try to contact me again. They are all disgusting people. They are not worth my time. Update number 2. I finally went back to work today after 2 weeks of leave. Thankfully, I still had enough time left in my maternity leave to take those extra days. My company's policy is pretty flexible, and I had only taken part of my 6 months off. At home, my daughter was with her Nanya woman I completely trust. She had excellent references, and I knew her personally before I hired her. She's amazing. But then, in the middle of my workday, I got a call. It was from her. And the first thing she said? She had taken my daughter to her house because she wasn't sure my home was safe anymore. Because of Scott. I agreed for the nanny to take my daughter and immediately called the police while rushing home. Over the phone, she told me what had happened. Scott had been standing outside my house, yelling for me to come out. When he realized I wasn't home, he started trying to break down the door. He was screaming profanities, and my daughter was crying. The nanny acted fast. She grabbed my daughter and slipped out the back door, cutting through the yard gate to her house just a few minutes away. She called me right away so I could get the police involved. Thanks to her quick thinking, my daughter was safe while I dealt with my ex and the cops. Honestly, I can't express how grateful I am to her. She did exactly what she should have. She put my child's safety first. By the time I got home, the police had already arrived. The moment I saw Scott, it was obvious he was drunk. In the middle of the day, it was pathetic. I had had enough. I filed a police report on the spot. I wanted him out of my life for good, and this was the perfect reason to file for a restraining order. The man was unstable. The cops took him away, and a few minutes later, my nanny came back with my daughter. I sent her home for the rest of the day. I wanted to stay with my baby myself. I'll probably have to take a few more days off work, but I don't care. I'd rather spend that time with the most important person in my life. Update number 3. Hey, it's been a few weeks since my last update. I've been busy taking care of my daughter, diving into a new project. It's been exciting, but here's the latest on my parents and Scott. I got the restraining order. Thankfully, it wasn't hard to prove that I needed one. I had surveillance footage from that day, clear evidence of Scott showing up drunk, screaming, trying to break into my home. I think my parents saw the state he was in and decided not to push their luck because they've kept their distance. For now. Scott, though, he lost the last people he had left. His parents told me that after everything that happened, they decided to cut him off. Apparently, Scott had been struggling to find another woman. He desperately wanted a family, but he couldn't do that alone, and he didn't want to adopt. Maybe that explains why he lost his mind that day. But that doesn't mean I owe him forgiveness. Same goes for my parents. That doesn't mean they've stopped their nonsense, though. They're still trying to smear my name to extended family, which is honestly just sad. It's not working. Everyone knows what they did to me. Now they're trying to play the victims, but it's too late. They're not fooling anyone. And the best part? They will never see their granddaughter. I won't allow it. My daughter and I are going to have a beautiful life, one where they have no place. And I'm going to be a much better parent than mine ever were. As always, thank you for your attention. Subscribe, leave a like, and have a great day.